Good morning. This is Timeline on this Monday morning, and this program is being recorded, so our play date for you isn't identified quite yet, but that's because you have to take advantage of this guest when she's in town. My guest this morning is Janet Hill Wozniak. Some of you recognize her last name, I'm sure, because in November, Janet and her husband Steve were in town to do some activities at the university, particularly two programs at the Lead Center. And in the second program in the afternoon, they awarded some scholarships to students in the School of Business, the School of Education, and in liberal arts, I think. So there were really all kinds of opportunities for kids that day. The Lead Center was absolutely packed. And you know what? Janet was every bit as interesting as Steve was. So when he hears this program, I want him to know that. She is just as much a good public speaker as he is. But both of them are highly entertaining. But I invited her here because I've known her a long, long time. We have an actual history. We have a shared history. So welcome to you, Janet.
Thank you so much, Clinice. It's great to be here today. Always happy to be back in Lawrence, Kansas.
Oh, see, isn't that sweet? And you're here this time because we've already explained that this is being recorded. So you're here because last night you attended a really neat event, and tell us what that was.
Oh, my brother got an Economic Development Award down in Baldwin. He owns Mid-America Bank in Baldwin, Lawrence, and Wellsville, and he got an award. He thought I was flying in to drive my parents from Texas to Kansas, which I did, but that was a ruse. It was really to come back and give him an award and give a little speech about how he's been a banker since he was 8 years old and tried to help me with my money management skills. But I was only 6 and wasn't quite as smart, but I eventually figured it out.
Congratulations. Tell us his full name.
His name is David Hill, and he's the president at Mid-America Bank.
And Hank was there.
Hank
for that
was
program.
There. It was really nice because I told Hank, guess what? I'm going to be on the radio tomorrow. Do you have any pointers for me or tips? And he was so nice. He just laughed, and he's a great guy.
Well, that's right. And Janet has a long history in Douglas County. Well, long. She's not old, but she has a long history in the time that she has lived because she first lived in, well, I should let you tell this. But let me just explain our relationship before we get any further. I met her because I was teaching at South, then called South Junior High School, now South Middle School. And she was the gifted instructor for all of those students who had been identified as kids needing enrichment programs and extensions of their regular classroom curriculum activities. And I worked with her a lot with my advanced English students. And we still have some of those students in common, and when we run into them, both of our names come up. So that was our initial meeting. However, we came to know each other over those years of teaching at South in several other ways. Janet was in one of Jim's and my Fair Play workshops one time. And so we've known her that way. And I've watched her, the evolution of her life since that time period. And she has had a lot of adventures, but she had a lot before she ever got to South. So let's just start at the very beginning. Let's start with grade school. Let's start with your mom and dad because a lot of people know who they are.
Yeah, my mom and dad are Mary Ann and Charles Hill, and they've always been educators. My dad was always a superintendent. My mom was a teacher, and they inspired me to be a teacher. So the early part of my career, I was a teacher. I taught for 3 years in Eudora. I taught science, and then I taught at the University of Kansas and at South Junior High at the time, South Junior High, and I taught at Central and also West. Southwest wasn't even a thought yet when I was teaching, but really enjoyed my teaching time. And when I was a gifted consultant at South, I always tried to get all the gifted kids to take Clinice's class because I knew if they took her class, they would come out an excellent writer. And the interesting part of that story is one day, probably about 5 years ago, I was sitting on a plane next to a girl, and I didn't recognize her, but she recognized me from our days at South Junior High. And she's a very successful lawyer in San Francisco. And as she sat next to me, she told me the reason she's a successful lawyer and a successful writer is because of Clinice Hills.
Well, that's very nice to hear.
That's a true story.
Thank you. That was unprompted, folks. I didn't know that she was going to go into that little scenario. But so no teacher ever turns that down. I mean, you'd love to think that you've had an impact on kids. And I know you had a huge impact on kids. But I also, when I watched you with students, noticed how much you were encouraging them to pursue their interests and develop their skills in using technology and keeping up with the changes. And that was early on. And part of that is because of what you did with your master's program at KU. So where did you go to high school?
So I went to high school for 2 years in Eudora and then 2 years in West Elk, which is in southern Kansas. Then I came up to Baker, did my undergraduate work at Baker.
So I knew you were at Baker, and Roger Boyd was one of your teachers
Roger
at Baker,
Boyd
right?
and Calvin Sink, and they were just both really influential professors. And I actually have a little present for Dr. Boyd that I picked up for him in Costa Rica recently. It's a bird statue because he taught me a lot about birds, and I really appreciated those two professors in particular.
He's going to be on Timeline in March, right after the first day of spring. I thought that was really
that's perfect.
Talk about the history of the wetlands and the Discovery Center and all the things that have opened up because now the road's finished. And so it's really, this is kind of what in educational terms Madeline Hunter would call a bird walk, which is appropriate since we're talking
We
birds.
like birds.
But we've gotten sidetracked here. Anyway, wetlands, and that's very dear to your heart because you had a lot to do with that when you were an undergraduate.
I love birds. I still love birds. I went on a cruise recently for 3 weeks through the Panama Canal, and every off-ship experience I took was bird watching. So probably I even got my husband to go bird watching with me, which is kind of an interesting feat. But I went bird watching in Cartagena, Colombia, and in Costa Rica and Panama and Mexico and Ecuador. Every single time I got off the ship, I wanted to see what birds were around.
That is something I did not know about you.
I love birds.
I'm glad to add that to my list of things I know about Janet Wozniak. Well, I'm a tree person, so every place I go, I love to look at trees. And yesterday, I persuaded, well, this will not be yesterday when you're hearing this, but as we're recording this, yesterday I persuaded my husband to go with me out on O'Connell Road and take a photograph of a sycamore tree against that bright blue sky. Now, sycamores are my favorite tree, and my favorite time for them is winter because I think their bark is exquisitely beautiful. And in case you think you've tuned into a nature show, we've just gotten sidetracked, and Janet and I have done that a lot in the history of our friendship. So I'm not going to apologize because I think that you'll find eventually we'll get back to the subject at hand, which really is, I really want to talk about sort of the evolution in terms of your educational experiences because it's funny how they all converged and merged and put you in the situation that you are in today in terms of the work that you do and the life that you are living. So you were at Baker. You got an undergraduate degree in biology, right?
Biology, mathematics, and education.
And did you teach for a while after that?
Yes. I taught at Eudora for 3 years, and then I taught at the University of Kansas and South because I was working on my first master's degree in biology, and I needed jobs. So I got a job at South and also taught at the university at the same time, and I actually had 4 jobs at that time. But
so what were you teaching at KU? When you
at KU at computer science class with Dr. Ron Ost.
Now, how did you do that, Janet? How did you get yourself into a position to be able to teach a computer class? Where did this happen along the way?
So I as soon as computers came out and were invented, and I was able to buy my first computer, I started a computer company, and I actually used to go around and consult with schools during the summer and do networks and stuff. That's what I did in my spare time. So what was kind of interesting is something that just was a hobby for me. It was something that I instantly loved and just couldn't get enough. So I ended up starting a business with computers, and then I was out presenting for that business, and that's when Apple saw me and invited me to interview, and then I got my job at Apple Computer.
You've taken a big leap here because we haven't really quite finished talking about your work at South, and also I understand the logic in science, the scientific method, that desire to have everything sort of tidy and neat and reasonable. And so I can see how, in some respects, that is a transition into loving the things that computers can do and that you can make them do. But how did you do that and get that into public schools? Because when you were at South, you were encouraging kids to use computers, but you weren't teaching
No, I wasn't teaching. What was funny is when I was at South, I don't even know if you knew this, but I had a little SE30. That was the model of Apple that I brought in every day with me. It weighed about probably 40 or 50 pounds, and I had a little bag.
Like a little refrigerator.
Yeah, I had a little bag that I wheeled it in. I had a little cart and a little bag that I put it in. I'd wheel it in and out every single day.
I don't remember
because
that.
at that time, the schools didn't even have computers, so I brought my
That's
own
right.
personal computer in to use and to help kids, explore.
Well, and every teacher who has ever had to fill out an IEP understands how nice it is to have a template and a computer to help you do that. Because when teachers had to laboriously enter every piece of information by hand and make sure that not only was it legible and accurate, but that it could be reproduced and copied for all the files that it had to be in, and that little piece of technology has changed things in so many ways for education, both positively and sometimes negatively.
Right. Sometimes it's a distraction.
It's a distraction, and the more information you can accumulate, the more ways you think of combining it and extrapolating from it, and then that becomes kind of a tyranny. And for people like you, I can imagine that it really is sort of a tyranny, because you think, oh, if I can do this, and what would happen if I did that? And so I think with the computer technology in our school systems, it's been is a no-brainer. Of course, it's a wonderful asset, and every teacher I know appreciates having the convenience of using computer programs to provide lesson plans for students and communicate with parents and put plans in motion for IEPs and other required things for the State Department. But at the same time, all that is true. What's the downside? Is there any downside? Now, if you can find a downside, I will be very interested in knowing what it might be.
The only downside I could see is we kind of have some interesting rules when our family goes out to dinner. Sometimes we have three children. I have 3 stepchildren with Waz. And sometimes when all of us go to dinner, we have a rule where everybody has to take out their phones. And so for me, I carry 2 phones. My husband carries between 6 and 8. Each of the kids carry one. So there'll be a pile of about 10 phones in the middle of the table. Everybody has to take their phone out, put it on the table. And if somebody's phone rings, if they want to answer it, they have to buy dinner. So that's our rule at our house, because otherwise people are like texting under the table or whatever. So we do, I think there are times when, you don't need technology. When you're sitting around with your family having dinner, you don't need to have a distraction, a phone call. You need to have a conversation and be in the moment with your family. So we do have some funny little games we play when we go to dinner with our cell phones and, put them out. And it's funny because it kind of works, but it's kind of interesting because as soon as dinner's over, everybody picks up their phone and they're on it for the next 5 minutes looking at what they missed.
You and Waz visit a lot of college campuses, and what I have noticed in the campuses that I've visited in the last 5 or 10 years, especially, I would say the last 5 years especially, they are quieter places than they used to be. When you were seeing kids go from class to class, that hum and chatter that used to be so much a part of Jayhawk Boulevard, for example, it's still there, but it's not the same because so many people are texting or reading texts, and their heads are bent, and they're not interacting with the people that are actually in their presence.
But the one thing is they might have more friends than you or I had when we were in college, because they might be communicating it with 50 different people, whereas I had 5 really good friends when I was in college. So it's just a different kind of communication. And for me, I like face-to-face. I mean, I do text and do all the social stuff, media, but I prefer face-to-face because that's where I think you have more of a relationship with the person, a deeper connection, a deeper relationship. But I do both. But I think today's kids are, they're digital natives. They were
digital natives. I love that expression. Is that original to you?
No. I've heard lots of people use that term, but it's a term, that describes, we're immigrants to using technology. Mm-hmm. The kids are digital natives. They just do it naturally. There's, kids born today that have never lived in a world without iPhones. Well, you and I have lived a long time before iPhones came around.
I didn't text until I learned that my grandchildren would not really communicate with me unless I texted. They weren't interested in email. Thought that was just pretty obsolete. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the history of Janet Wozniak and her work with Apple, because I think that in itself is a fascinating story. This is Timeline. We'll be back in a minute. Depend on it. All right, everybody, we're back with Timeline, and as I told you at the beginning of the program, we are recording this because I wanted to take advantage of having a time when my guest was actually in Lawrence and we could get together to visit. My guest is Janet Wozniak, Janet Hill Wozniak. Her parents live here. She has a family in Douglas County, and this is not an unusual place for her to be, but she's a visitor now. She doesn't live here anymore. Janet lives in California and travels widely internationally with her husband, Steve Wozniak. And as I also said at the beginning of the program, Janet and Steve were here in November when we really tried to do this program, but things got in our way and we didn't get it done. But they were here to do some wonderful things for the University of Kansas, and that was a great visit that they had, and they made a huge impression on kids and made some very nice contributions to KU. So thank you, and tell Steve thank you.
We will.
You know, I'm sure that people are very appreciative, but in terms of that, I would suspect that you also are besieged by requests. You're nodding.
That's an understatement.
An understatement. So we'll come back to that because I think that's a really interesting part of how your life has changed. But what I want to talk about right now, or want you to tell us about right now, are your first experiences after leaving public education. You have been doing a lot of things with computers and doing presentations, and you were discovered. You weren't sitting on a stool at a soda fountain like Lana Turner, but you were discovered doing a presentation for Apple or with Apple.
Right. So I had started my own computer company back in the day, and I was given a presentation. I was giving a presentation out at the MACE conference, which is the Kansas technology conference for educators. And somebody from Apple saw me there and then said, you should apply for this job. And
now, MACE is an organization, isn't that really closely tied to another Lawrence teacher?
Linda Heiler has been in that organization and has done a lot of work with them for years. And it stands for Mid-America Computers in Education. And so it's, teachers are who show up there, present there, and attend the conference.
Mm-hmm. And Linda also taught with us at
Yes,
South.
yes.
She now is retired. And I have a whole sidebar story about that, but we'll probably really get distracted if we go into that one. So you were at this conference and someone saw you. Who is it who said that to you?
It was a guy, his name was Craig Foose. He actually at the time worked for a sales agent for Apple. And so I think he actually helped me line up